What happens if the bank you've deposited your money with goes into a bank run of some sort, where customers, due to fear of the bank collapsing, go in and take their money out, which increases the rate at which the bank collapses? Now, reserve banks are supposed to stop this from happening in the sense that your reserve bank has extra money, so if any bank has too much demand for the money kept in it, it borrows from the reserve bank and then returns it back when need be. But in the days of bank runs, this was quite a serious concern. A specific economy which I'd like to discuss today is the economy of South Africa, which has been undergoing a bank run for several decades and looks like it might spiral further out of control as a result of the same factors as it had before. Now, if you look at the rand dollar, in 1995, you could get three rand 58 per dollar, and it used to be much better for the rand at one stage, but it's lost a lot of its value just in 10 years. It's lost a lot of its value. It was 6.45 in 2004, and then 8, then 11, then so forth until present day. And recently it even hit 16.87. South Africa's got a funny situation involved with it, and that situation goes back to something called the Pareto principle and something else called the brain drain, which is often talked about involving Africa. Now, to give a quick clip of Jordan Peterson talking about Pareto, imagine instead of this being a company, he's talking about this being a country.
Price's law. Here's Price's law. This is something to hammer into your heart. The square root of the number of people in a domain do 50% of the work. Okay, so let's go through that. You have 10 employees. 3 of them do half the work. Makes sense. That's reasonable. You have 100 employees. 10 of them do half the work. Well, that's a problem. So the other 90% are doing the other half. Who cares about them? You have 10,000 employees. 100 of them do half the work. Right, so here's a nasty little law. As your company grows, incompetence grows exponentially and competence grows linearly. Got it? Right? Because with 10, it's 3 who are doing half the work, but at 10,000, it's 100 that are doing half the work. So 9,900 of your employees are doing as much as the best 100. You might not even know who the best 100 are, but probably they know, and maybe their peers know too. And so one of the things that's really interesting when big companies start to shake, which means maybe they've had a bad quarter or 2 bad quarters, and the stock price starts to tip down, and the hot people who have options are not very happy about that, and maybe they start to announce layoffs. All the 100 people who have opportunities leave, and they're the ones who were doing half the work. So boy, that puts your company in a pretty rough situation, because now you've got the 9,900 people left over who were only doing half the work. And the next time you announce layoffs, the next most productive 100 leave. And so then you're left with nobody who's productive and a massive overhead payroll. Price's law. You can look that up. De Sola Price. De Sola Price.
And what country in the world is undergoing this sort of retrenchments, fleeing the country thing to a greater degree than most other countries in the world? There is one country. Here is a video from Economics Explained, which is an Australian channel, but they give pretty standard ordinary economics.
Transferable assets you can and ship them overseas to your new home. This is called capital flight, and this is a major cause for concern, particularly in South Africa. When that house or car or business is sold, the values of these non-movable assets drop. When South African rand is sold for American dollars, this drops the value of South Africa's currency. And when material and non-material assets are transferred out of the country is that much poorer for it.
And South Africa is having certain impacts of this capital flight. For instance, a low estimate is that 23,000 people leave per year, and that these are people who can get visas or otherwise can leave and are wanted in other countries outside of South Africa. And according to Wikipedia, I know it's not a great source, but it's useful in this case, they say that about for each South African who leaves, each one of these high-skilled South Africans, it costs about 10 people their jobs. And while Wikipedia won't say the exact amount, they say that the majority of South Africans are not in employment if you look at them as a whole. And if you look at an economist such as Mark Schussler, it gets down to something like 25% are employed in the formal economy. About 40% of South Africans are employed overall, but then you have the unemployment rate as it currently stands of about officially 34.4, though the expanded rate's higher than that, and the even more expanded rate of absolutely the amount of people who have jobs or don't is quite scary, because something like 25% of people have jobs in the formal economy. And of course, South Africa's got a complex economy. It talks about nationalization, land redistribution, and you hear about how the World Bank forced privatization. But what really happened in South Africa is not a problem of privatization, but a problem with state resources which worked in the state had to be sold. And because of government policies, only certain people were allowed to buy them, who weren't people who were necessarily capable when it came to actually doing that type of business, but rather people who were politically connected, because only people of a certain demographic were allowed to purchase shares or certain amounts of shares or to get certain amounts of jobs. Things were specifically cordoned off. And so if you are selling off state-owned enterprises and the only people who can buy those state-owned enterprises or the right amount of them are people of a certain demographic, chances are that demographic, if it's been seeing bad times for a long time, will be the politically connected part of that demographic. So you have lots of people leaving the country, and it's probably a lot higher than this, as the 23,000 per year that Rand Merchant Bank's chief executive James Formby says, and he himself says it's probably a lot higher. If you look just at the example of Ireland, in about 2014, there were 30,000 Irish passport holders in South Africa. And in recent years, there's 3,000 passports to Irish citizens a year, to people who seemingly were born in South Africa largely. And if you look in the last census in Ireland, you had about 8,000 or so people born in South Africa who were living in Ireland in 2016. And if you look at South Africans in Ireland, which is just a Facebook group, there's 9.5 thousand. And if you look at South Africans moving to Ireland, a Facebook group, you'll find that there are 17,000 members or more of that. And Ireland's a small country when it comes to these sorts of things. And South Africa's problems are more than simply the economy and the way in which its economy has been very badly affected. It's also got something which also causes some of that flight and which is resultant of some of that capital flight, which is its murder rates, which are some of the worst of any country in the world, along with its rape rates. There are articles which will compare South Africa to war zones and find that war zones have less people being killed within them than South Africa as a country has ordinarily. You also have the specific targeting of rural farmers in attacks. And ordinarily, if you look at demographics of people who are murdered, people living in rural areas would be a rather small portion of that versus people living in urban areas. And people who are killed by people who aren't the same race as them are a very small portion of murders, as with people killed by people who don't know them. And yet, the portion of murders in South Africa farmers is incredibly high, and it's also resulting in more of the same capital flight from the country. But this situation which you have, which involves crime, also involves other factors of decay and the falling apart of society. Now, the bare branches are something which has been studied quite extensively in Asia. It's the idea that young unmarried men are most likely, if they don't have some sort of future or some sort of way to climb the ladder, they are most likely to try to overthrow the system. Systems become unstable when a large amount of men are unable to marry. And another factor is that when you look at statistics of fatherlessness and the amount of people who are in jail, you look in the American statistics that 90% of young men in prison grew up without a father. And you have 85% of people arrested in the UK who had no father. And there's a whole lot of other factors that affects your ability to earn a living, to finish school, to so many other things. And what's South Africa's statistics there? Well, according to the South African government broadcaster SABC, 62% of children born in South Africa in 2018 had no father listed on the birth certificate. And rates of fatherlessness, especially in the African population in South Africa, are incredibly high, as are divorce rates and other factors. And what you get out of this sort of thing is a situation where you can have very big problems emerge, such as rioting. Now, the riots which are most recently famous are not even listed when I look in Bing for the riots, which were the 2020 riots, which killed 337 or so people. But South Africa, according to AFP some time ago, they found that there were something like over 300 riots a year at one point, which just were not being reported. And so when you go back to South Africa and you go back to economic collapse, you go back to brain drain, and you go back to things such as Pareto and Price's law, South Africa really is a tinderbox right now. And the way in which you can look at it is not simply as, oh, it's an example of a country which became more free market capitalist. They have some of the strictest regulations on who you can hire, who you can fire. They have among the worst labor relations rates in the world, not with your highly educated people within it, but within the official statistics involving all South Africans. And I know very educated South Africans often have a good name for the so-called Protestant work ethic and so forth of working quite hard. But South Africa, nonetheless, is rated among the worst for labor relations in the world. And they have labor laws which exacerbate that. And South Africa also, within that context, has extensive interference in the economy. You have BEE, wherein who you can hire, who can invest in a company, who can own a company, and so forth, is very regulated according to their skin color. And this is something which the South African government is enforcing all the more and strengthening after over 20 years in power, which is quite a problematic thing to be doing, when if it were something which were actually having a good effect, surely it would have had one now. Instead, the major effect seems to have been capital flight. It seems to be that people who the South African government said should not be doing too well in the economy because they divided things according to a sort of fixed pie rather than trying to grow the pie, that they said, well, you shouldn't be able to do well anymore, so you shouldn't be able to get a job. And those people left quite often, to an extent that South Africa now seems to be quite in danger of experiencing the effects of Price's law, in the same sense that a company which is doing retrenchments too often as a solution to their labor problems experiences Price's law and becomes in danger of collapse. South Africa's infrastructure has not been properly maintained either. And it's quite a problematic situation for the country. But the strange and terrible thing about it is that South Africa currently, if you look at the state of its citizens and the quality of life they have, and you compare your average black South African to your average Botswanan or Mauritian or so forth, that the current inequality in South Africa has been exacerbated. The economy has become worse, and with the leaving of a lot of the capital in the country and a lot of the skills in the country which haven't been replaced, again, it's economic collapse of the family, and collapse of civil society in the sense of a lot of murder, a lot of other crimes which get involved. And to view South Africa and to say, where will it be in 10 years or where will it be in 20 years, is to ask a question which can't be answered exactly, but can be answered to a very high degree if you ask yourself, is this a country which is going to be able to recover after the COVID crisis, which has exacerbated the fall of its economy? And when you look at the statistics of how many more people are leaving or want to leave the country after the COVID restrictions and after the collapse there, you begin to see even more capital flight as likely. And South Africa might be able to replace the population which it loses from other countries which are poorer than it, but it can't replace those skills to the same degree, which take years to learn and which require high levels of skill and schooling to get in the first place. And the most essential thing for me to look at within South Africa is not just the statistics about fatherlessness, the statistics about breakup of marriage, the statistics about all of these factors such as unmarried young men, but to look at Price's law. Now, Price's law is an extension of Pareto. Pareto says that something like 20% of a population will own 80% of what it has. And South Africa definitely had that sort of ratio, though South Africa's government is looking at possibly expropriating that amount, which will likely lead to even more capital flight and which will lead to even more disappearance of wealth from South Africa as skills disappear from it and as money disappears from it. The reason economics tells us for South Africa's collapse is not merely corruption or crime or those sort of things. Those follow the capital flight to a large degree and cause more capital flight as they go. And my understanding from people who live in South Africa is that it's at such a bad state that people often can't walk outside or feel safe in areas which were previously safe. It's a country which is facing collapse, perhaps now, but perhaps to a much, much greater degree than it has ever faced collapse before.